So thank you very much again. And that leads us to the next speaker, Manuel. I think you are also a diver, I guess, and also a sailor. You're living on a boat. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit where you are. I think you are in your boat. And then please let us know what is your project Manaya, what is that about, and what are you doing research and educational wise in the Mediterranean?
Okay, so thanks first of all for having me. And yes, all of the above are true. I was working as a diving instructor a long time ago, just like Robert. Realized it doesn't pay a lot, so I decided to go into marine biology. Turns out it pays even worse, but at least it makes me happy. So by now, I'm happy enough to be sitting on a sailboat, and we are actually running research expeditions throughout the Mediterranean Sea. So all summer long, we fill the boat up with biologists on one side and simply interested people who want to find out more or who want to learn or who want to help with various projects that we're running. And that's what we've been doing for the last 7 years now in the Mediterranean Sea. And so far, it works well and, well, gives us something to do and at least gives me the feeling of doing something useful. Whether or not it actually is yet to be discussed or to be found out, but we're trying our best. And that's in in the spirit of being honest, at least I can honestly say I'm really trying to do something here. Yeah. And that's actually the boat that I'm sitting on right now. At the time we were sailing down the coast of Sardinia. And I'm quite happy that Robert handled all the definitions and all the statistics and all the nice mathematical parts. So I can just tell stories now, which is great, right down my aisle. I do have a few numbers down my sleeve though, um, but they will come when the time is right. So clearly, we are also not exactly in the global south, since it is part of the headline of the symposium today. I have to admit, we are only on the border to the global south, so to speak. So with Sicily being right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, we're pretty much right there. But the Mediterranean Sea for us is one of the super interesting spots, not just for climate change, for heat waves, but also for many other reasons. So when it comes to the marine environment in general, the Med has always been a very tricky spot. So for one, there was always different cultures around. Right now, we have more than 20 countries bordering it. And just for that reason, there's a lot more pressure on the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, you already mentioned the blue crab fisheries on the Libyan Sea. And yes, blue crab is invasive and is causing issues in the Adriatic Sea as well. But aside from catching invasive species, there's also lots of other fisheries going on, and the pressure is immense simply because there's so many countries on a relatively small amount of water. So if you think about the Mediterranean Sea, it only makes up for about 2% of the world's water, which is nothing really. And yet it holds up to 20% of the marine biodiversity of the entire planet, which in comparison is quite a great number. And especially when it comes to climate change or the temperature changes, we say now that in the last 20 years, the Mediterranean has been heating by almost half a degree per decade, which is quite a bit more than the rest of the world. I mean, Arctic aside, but the rest of the, uh, let's say, inhabited or massively inhabited world. So that also means that in the last couple of years, we have been looking at waters increasing the temperature quite a lot. And this, for example, is the water temperature from this morning, so brand new number. And while I have to admit, windy is not the most sophisticated or scientific source for temperatures or wind, it is always a good place to look for a ballpark number. And the ballpark number in the last, I would say, 5 decades that I've been looking at would be that in the winter, the Mediterranean Sea should have a temperature somewhere in the mid-teens. So depending on where you are, you would be down to 12 degrees, you might be up to 16, 17. But right now, pretty much all over the Mediterranean Sea, we're at 19 degrees, which is, well, therefore about 2 to 4 degrees warmer than it really should be at this time of the year. And obviously, right now it is winter here. So it is a decent temperature. But last summer, it looked, well, similarly different. So we were scratching the 30 degrees this summer quite a lot. And in many parts of the Mediterranean, we actually cracked the 30 degrees, which on one hand is fine, and on the other, it's not at all. So historically, the Med has always had a temperature fluctuation of about 10 degrees from summer to winter. But that being said, it used to be about 5 degrees less than what we have now. So, I mean, if you go swimming in the Med, you will see lots of seagrass, you'll see algae, you'll see all sorts of things. If you get lucky, you even see a small coral of about a centimeter in size or so. But nowhere do you see anything like this. So we don't have coral reefs. And that's simply because historically our waters were too cold. And coral wants a temperature somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees. So more than 30, it dies off. It comes to coral bleach. Less than 20, it's simply too cold for it to actually thrive. And that's why we never had reefs. And nowadays, even the small corals that we have in the Mediterranean, in the summer, they do bleach. So all of a sudden, we're too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, which makes for a very wicked balance. And Robert mentioned it quite nicely earlier when he said, depending on the event of the heat wave, it can be absolutely catastrophic for an environment, or it can be relatively mild. So in terms of coral in the Med, catastrophic would probably be the case, but as of right now, we don't yet have it. But given enough time, we might just get it. But we do have plenty of other shifts at the moment, and there's other things that come from warmer waters that do stick around and are quite successfully so. So you already mentioned the blue crab earlier, but we do have a bunch of other invasive species or introduced species that come in from tropical areas. So we have cornet fish, we have pufferfish, we have rabbitfish, which are all not big issues as such, but they do come with the handicaps, as they don't have any natural enemies in the area. So they will just reproduce in massive mounds and can basically flatten an area around them. So while the temperature, for example, is not directly influencing the growth of algae, we have rabbitfish in the bottom right corner. And because of the sheer amount that they show up with and the crazy reproductive rates that they have, they can take out entire fields of algae within a season, basically. And that will take a couple of years to grow back if it would ever come back. We have now, since about 5 years, these long-spined sea urchins, where in the last 2 years, we've watched them basically clear out entire reefs. So not coral reefs, but algae reefs. And they left behind nothing but plain rock. And simply because they do not have any enemies in the area, they can, well, reproduce and graze away quite happily. And the same is true for lionfish and pufferfish. So they did come into the Mediterranean because the warming waters do benefit them. And well, the Suez Canal down to the Red Sea is not really a barrier. It's really an open canal at this point where any fish, any animal can simply swim through. And if you come to an area where the temperature is fine, where there's no enemies, there's plenty of food, might as well stick around. So that's what's happening with all the invasive species that we get into the Med these days. And as mentioned, we came back here 7 years ago now, and we got quite lucky because when we got our first boat that we were running in the Mediterranean, it was also the first year of the new Medicanes that Robert mentioned briefly. And yeah, the Med has this beautiful reputation of being basically a bathtub in the summer. That's why many sailors love it. That's why swimmers used to love going to the Mediterranean, because there's nothing dangerous in the water. The weather is gentle, the wind is calm and always quite pleasant. Doesn't matter if you're sailing or surfing or just swimming. And then all of a sudden, well, a few things changed. There was more temperature, more heat, as we already learned earlier. More temperature or warmer waters hold a lot more energy, and at some point, all this energy has to go somewhere. And that, in this case, ended up with the Medicane, which, of course, at the time was sort of declared a once-in-a-lifetime event, only to be repeated about a month later, and then 3, 4 more times the year after. And since then, the Medicanes basically became a somewhat regular occurrence in the Mediterranean Sea, and we see them year after year these days. So while they might not always have been here, they did show up now and they will stick around. And of course, with the warming temperatures, also on land, we have similar issues. So less rainfall or less manageable rainfall, let's call it that. And then everything dries out, and even a small spark will cause a fire that is then very hard to get in shape again. So this is, for example, a view that we get in the summer almost every week somewhere, because wildfires are becoming incredibly regular in the Mediterranean Sea. But our main project, or our main focus, really is the seagrass. So Posidonia oceanica is, in my eyes, the star of the show, and in many ways a sort of dramatic hero in the Mediterranean Sea. So, because especially now that blue carbon is becoming a topic and climate change is becoming, well, let's say, more accepted, even in areas where you wouldn't necessarily assume it. Okay, some presidential elections are sort of a kick in the back and make me hesitate on that statement again. But seagrass has been acknowledged as a massive carbon sink. And it's great that we finally got to the point. And yes, it does have the ability to secure crazy amounts of carbon, but it takes time. So that is one major benefit of it. But everything good anyways always takes a lot of time up, and therefore it takes a bit of patience. But if you look at the seagrass meadow in the Mediterranean, they can have these thick mats underneath, which is the rhizome. It's basically what made up the plant in the first place. And they can grow meters thick. But for it to grow that thick, it takes hundreds of years. And all of this is basically plain stored carbon, which is absolutely beautiful. But if it is ripped out for whatever reason, be it an anchor or something else, the carbon will come back out and it will be free again. So it only stays stored as long as the plant is healthy and underwater. But in recent years, what we saw a lot is that, well, going diving, snorkeling in one spot, one day you see this. And now the next couple of pictures are actually from the same spot over the course of 1 week. So there was Sardinia 2 years ago, one of the first big heat waves that we saw firsthand, where life on board the boat became rough, to say the least. And after only 2 days of crazy heat, the water was up to 29 to 30 degrees. And all of a sudden, we saw this white snot all over the seagrass. And basically what it is, it's phytoplankton. So it's plant-based plankton, which would generally be tiny and just free floating. But if there's enough nutrition and if the water is warm enough, it will grow like an explosion. So it will just, well, hang thick in the water, and at some point it sinks down and it will just create a layer on top of whatever is there. And in that case, it was the seagrass, which at that point is not the end of the world just yet, because if the water does cool down, and usually comes or cools down with big winds, which usually comes with big waves, and that would wash it off again. But if that event comes too late, in that case, it was another 3 days, basically what happens is that the seagrass, well, for one, because it gets less light, and for the other, because the water keeps heating, it just dies off. So basically in 1 week, we went from nice, juicy green and active meadow to a brown to almost white colored seagrass meadow that was done. And yeah, once that happened, it's not coming back. And that's when what Robert mentioned earlier with this catastrophic events where it just takes, or it might not come back. This is where it really kicks in the Mediterranean Sea. Because for one, you have these amazing meadows that have the ability to store a lot of carbon, that are home to basically 1/3 of everything that lives in the Mediterranean Sea. And all it takes is one single week of crazy heat that it's just not designed for, and an entire meadow is out. But it takes hundreds of years for this meadow to grow back. And looking at the trends that we have right now of heat waves basically coming through several times a year, and that nowadays pretty regular, it means that on the long run, it looks a lot as if we were to lose these meadows. And if we do lose Posidonia, we basically lose up to 1/3 of everything that lives in the Mediterranean Sea. And once you lost 1/3, it's a question of a matter of a couple of years maybe before you lose all the rest. So that really is one of the main reasons why we're focusing on the seagrass. And basically what we have been doing now in the last 7 years is everywhere we go, and we try to revisit the same sites many times over and over again over a couple of years. We physically measure the meadows in order to see what happens to them. Because in many areas we have witnessed that the seagrass meadows shrink. And that's partly related to temperature, partly it's nutrition, as in too much nutrition that comes washing off from the mainland. But we do see massive changes in the composition of the meadows. And the only way to really work out how much it is by physically going there and measuring the meadows, which is a slow, long process, but it has to be done. And it's for us the best way to work out what's actually going on. And what I found quite striking with this is even going through literature where you see where Posidonia oceanica should be, eventually you come across maps like this. And on that one, for example, the idea is that every green dot that's somewhere along the coast is an existing meadow. And that's, well, still now one of the most up-to-date ones you can find in the literature. So if you look on ResearchGate or whichever one is your favorite source of papers like this. But the truth is that, for example, the Northern Adriatic, there is no more seagrass. Southern Sicily is basically empty. And so are many other places where on this map it still shows seagrass. But in the very positive spirit of, the Constructify media looking for solutions approach, we too were trying to work out what on earth we could potentially do to work against this. And while it's definitely not the answer to climate change or to heat waves in general, I think it does make a difference. So seagrass has a couple of very useful, helpful things for us. So it is a straightforward, normal plant. And just like every plant you would find on land, it does have flowers and it blooms. And just like everything that blooms, at some point a fruit comes out. And in that case, it's, well, their seeds, they look like olives. They're the same size, look just like it. And eventually they will detach from the plant and start floating. And then they're up on the surface, and eventually they would crack open and seed sinks down and in theory starts growing again. In reality, their survival rate is somewhere around 2%, maybe. So even a lot of seeds only make a handful of plants. The beauty of it, though, is that if you collect those seeds and you can actually keep them quite easily. So basically you throw them in a jar with salt water, put them in the fridge, and you can store them for weeks on the time. And if you take those seeds and you plant them actively somewhere in a place where there used to be seagrass, and ideally you still have the roots, you can boost the survival rates from 2% all the way up to 90, which is a lot better than their starting chance. And that is what we have been doing now for the last couple of years. And basically we try to establish a network of dive centers, of organizations, even of private individuals who want to help these efforts. And wherever they may be, we go visit and we run workshops with them and basically try to encourage as many people as possible to participate in these endeavors. And the other nice thing that can be done is even if seagrass was to be ripped out, and that as well happens more and more. So for one, again, seagrass and anchors are not friends. So sailboats or boats in general are actually part of the problem here. But also the storms that we are getting more severe and stronger, and they can actually take out big pieces of meadows. And you would find lots of these ripped out plants on the beaches washed up somewhere. And those are quite grateful for being put back into the water. So while free floating, they can't do a lot. When you take those and you stick them back into the ground, and again, you can wedge them between rocks, you can stick them into soil or just wedge them in between roots, they will start growing again and they will have another good fighting chance, which is any day better than not doing anything at all. So we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and by now we have more than 20 dive centers that are listed on the website as well. So if you come across plants or seeds, they can be dropped off there and they will put them back in the ground. So the full list is all on the website available. These are just a couple of the spots where we stopped last year and we did start the replanting efforts again. But ultimately, the whole topic of climate change and heat waves, and it hit me again when Orbit was going through all his points, and it's just, he put it quite nicely. It's a very controversial topic, and in many ways, it becomes almost philosophical. And I do have to agree with him. Many of the topics are things where it would be best to just sit down with a beer with someone and have a long discussion because there's so many ins and outs. And especially when it comes to diversity or biodiversity or habitat loss in the Mediterranean Sea, I mean, you have the warming waters, which means you lose the seagrass, which could bind the carbon, which in return could be a solution to the existing problem, but it all sort of snowballs into the wrong direction. And counteracting it will, of course, work, but still the best, I mean, even planting a million seeds is not as good as keeping a million plants that have been there for a long time. So 1 square meter of seagrass that has been growing and living for a decade is better than planting a square meter any day. So in many ways, it really boils down to trying to keep what we have in the best possible shape that we can get it in. And well, in the end of the day, I think whatever any single person of us can do to get the job done will be a good step in the right direction. And while Robert as well said, yes, carbon emissions are a big part of the problem, but that again, I think is something where we like to oversimplify. So even looking at protests at universities or even high schools, you see people who say, yeah, carbon emissions have to be cut. And I absolutely agree. Don't get me wrong. I'm 100% with those people, and I would agree with all of this any day. But carbon emissions do not necessarily mean the same thing as stop driving a car. It does not necessarily mean stop flying a plane. Carbon emissions also means production of the newest cell phone. It means, I don't know, the choice of car. It means your choice of how you want to live. Do I live in an apartment? How high do I put the heating? So all those small or supposedly small decisions add to our carbon footprint every single day. And those are things that are very often overlooked. And I think that's something we all should sort of keep in the back of our heads. Yeah. And that would be my few drops of wisdom on that topic.